It's a pleasure to have all of you here to look at best practices and standards for ocean observations. I'd like to also acknowledge my colleagues, Pauline Simpson, Siggy Kluckner, Renee Garello, and El Khalil Sharif, who are members of the IEEE team. This is as much a discussion as it is a presentation, and so there will be questions that I'll pose that I'd like you to answer in the chat at the halfway point and then finally toward the end. Also, your questions are welcome. Let me start out by just providing the background of the presentation, both of the topic, the presenter, myself, and the IEEE team. IEEE France has 3,000 members. IEEE, as an international nonprofit organization, has 500,000 members in 162 countries. And so it brings a strong technological base and a science base to the discussions. I should comment on the picture. Some people have said they don't recognize me without my hat, so I put a picture of myself with my hat. Let's dive into the subject then. I'd like to leave you with the bottom line. The core of best practices are providing trust, interoperability, and inclusiveness. All of these rely on creating and using documents that are common among us, which we call standards and best practices. The history is interesting. If you go back to the FOO of 2011, which originated from the Ocean Ops 2009, key attributes for ocean observing are the 5 shown here, and you know 2 of them relate to the use of best practices, documentation and sharing of best practices, and also assessments of readiness levels. In some cases, for observing systems, readiness levels may be TRLs, technology readiness levels. In the case of best practices, we've developed a maturity scale, which has the same effect. So first, we have to ask, what are best practices and what are standards? Best practices are really bottom-up. They evolve from individually developed methods, and the practice can transition as it's adopted by the community to either a best practice, an endorsed practice, and or a standard. Standards, on the other hand, are top-down. They're developed through standards organizations, ISO, OGC, IEEE, in Europe, CEN, and these are then propagated outward to the community. Some are required, some are recommendations. But on the whole, standards and best practices ensure consistency and uniformity in how things are done and how things are produced. And that's important if we're trying to do global comparisons of various attributes, the essential ocean variables, for example. The other thing that they provide is a common language and a set of rules. So when people say they've done this, and people can understand how they've been done. So let me start with the beginning. We had an interesting experience in a summer school, which was held in Northern Africa a couple of years ago. We were represented by Cora Hurstman, and she provided the students with a blank sheet of paper and then asked them to provide a paper boat. And initially, about 10% of the students were able to create a boat from that blank sheet of paper. Well, at the next point, she provided a best practice or a practice to create a boat by folding the paper. And when that was done, the students all were able to create the boat. It's a good example of how defining a practice really facilitates all of us to do our job. Now, there are many questions that come from best practices or about best practices. They're fundamental, and what I'd like to do is spend the next 10 minutes or so going through these questions and then giving you an opportunity for a discussion and maybe further questions. The first one is, why should I use them? It's an effort to learn new methods. What's the value? And if you want to use them, where can I find them? How do I know which one to choose? Because there may be many. And finally, and probably as important, is how can I create one once I do my own research or applications? And I should comment that best practices here cover the full range of what we call the value chain, from the calibration of sensors, the initial observations, the data, all the way through to applications and policy. And so keep that in mind as we move forward. So let's start on the first one. Why should I use best practices and standards? I showed an example just a minute ago in terms of paper folding, but there really are a lot of value in the adoption and the use of best practices. One is quality and consistency of the observations. A second is the interoperability of the data. Many times, if you have to start from scratch, you'll spend time inventing a process when in fact there may be one available, and that it creates efficiency in your work. Transparency, connections between data, models, and applications. As I mentioned, we're doing the full value chain. And then a resource for training and capacity development. But, and I say but before because this was done some time ago, there are issues. Not all practices are documented. They're scattered, and it's hard to find them. They can be lost when a project ends, and in fact, we've seen that occurring. Promising methods may not be shared. And finally, and really very, very important, the work to create the practice, which is an effort, is often not acknowledged. So we address these issues and recognize that a system for creating, supporting, facilitating, and then storing best practices was essential to move forward. And a system was created under the IOC, which is the Ocean Best Practices System. And the system was designed to facilitate sharing methods, research, operations, and applications. And at the present time, there are about 2,000 practices in the repository. And to the right, I show you the web page, which is available, and the address is at the top, oceanbestpractices.org. A second repository was created more recently by the European Commission Ocean Best Practices and Standards System. We call that in short EC-OBPSS. We're asked what's the difference between these different practices, and there are some differences that are important to recognize. The OBPS, the IOC system, has more practices, almost 20 times what the European system has. The European system is focused on observations, while the IOC system includes applications, data management, and other areas. The European system has better quality control and includes metadata which allows for more effective search, metadata such as what platforms are used or what sensors are used. You can sort to those things. So the two systems support the availability of best practices, and you can use them as resources. As I mentioned, there are other issues you have to address. The research community said, but I don't want to publish because I don't get peer review credit for publishing a best practice or a method. And so there were other features of the Ocean Best Practice system that were important in supporting the community in addition to the repository. We have a journal. It's a special topic within the Frontiers in Marine Science, which has received a lot of publications in the areas of methods and is very well received. there's training capability, and there's also user support. And these come together into a system that is focused on users as the central effort to support. In addition, there are expanded activities, task teams on particular topics, support for early career professionals, and then a decade program, Ocean Practices. That's the foundation for you. Let's go to the next question. Which best practice should I choose? The repositories, which, as I said, for OBPS has more than 2,000 methods, present an opportunity for a really comprehensive capability to search for methods. How do you search for them? You can go by subject or author or EOV even. There are some key areas, however, that will tell you how well received, how well used is the practice by the community. That's in the area of maturity, endorsement, and maybe others. And so we're adding new features and capabilities to the repository, to the system, that allow you to do more effective searches. We're also looking at opening to informatics and looking at perhaps AI as a way to help you in selecting and using practices. Let me move now to how you can move forward with creating a practice. This is a recipe that was created by Rachel Preslovsky and a team, and it goes through a cycle which was developed initially in Australia and demonstrated there and has been adopted by the Ocean Best Practice System and used in the European system upcoming. The first steps are in scope and recruit. Second are development and release. And the third is revise and ratify. So we're looking at the full life cycle here. The first step is really to confirm the need. What's essential? What type of training is needed for it? What type of review methods? And working with the community. We're doing that in OPSI for CLIM in the physical oceanography area and looking at where there may be gaps and how we can work together to create best practices for physical oceanography. Then we form a working group where there's a discussion, develop content, and there are multiple cycles, for example, consulting in the working group and creating a straw man and then going back and iterating until a final draft is created. That final draft goes out to community review, and then it goes to users after it's released to invite feedback on a continuing basis, ultimately looking to contain the new material into a consolidated, updated version, and then looking for endorsement across the community. So those are the steps that we're looking at. We're here to help you with that. If you have questions, please ask us. The other thing that's important is to create a standard documentation for a practice. This allows people to be able to read it, know what to expect. And the Ocean Best Practice System has a number of templates in sensors, in data, in ocean observing and applications, for example. Modeling is also included. And these are available on our website, and you can go to repository link here and get access to them. And if you have questions on them, then we'd be happy to address them with you. In selecting best practices, we're offering, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, various characterizations of the practices. We have created a maturity model, a metric basically, which is comparable to the TRLs, which you can use to assess it. I'm going to talk about that in some detail in just a moment. In response to the question just asked, we'll also talk about the endorsement process. There's also another area of, do you know if there are a lot of people using them or not? And so the degree of uptake of a best practice can be a metric you can use to decide what you want to select. Then we have options for increased accessibility of practices. OPSI for CLIM is sponsoring a creation of a federated network for accessing methods where the methods are across multiple repositories. And then you'll have questions and we'll provide training and support. Let me start out then with the first topic, which is the maturity model. In the time frame of about 2018, so about 7 years ago, we had to address the question of what is a best practice. And we created a definition, and this is from the steering group of the Ocean Best Practice System, that a best practice is a methodology that has repeatedly produced superior results relative to other methods with the same objective. And in that, there were a lot of methods that we show across the bottom. And this definition comes from a paper for the OceanOps 2019, which was Pearlman et al., and I show the reference there. That has a very extensive discussion also on not only best practices, but in standards and their relation, giving some very specific examples of the evolution of best practices. But this definition was not sufficient because you run into the case of how do I know that a method has repeatedly produced superior results? What does that mean? Can you quantify it? And relative to what other methods? And so about 4 years ago, a discussion was held and a decision was made to move forward with a more quantitative method to assess the practices. And that's what I'd like to talk about now, addressing the fundamental question of what is a best practice. We introduced a 5-level maturity curve. This came in part from experience in the software industry, where they were looking at maturity of various software capabilities, and in industry. And the 5-level was ideal because it was fine enough you could actually point where a practice is, but it wasn't so large, such as the TRL have 10 levels in essence, 9 levels formally, in which it wasn't clear exactly which level the practice would fall into. So with the 5-level system, the first one's formation, then the document, the process has to be repeatable, it's well documented, it's broadly adopted, and in the 5th level, it's sustained. And let me talk about what the 3 top levels are and what they mean. In level 3, it's formally documented, openly available, and can be replicated by an expert who's not the creator. Repeatable means that in level 2, that the creator can duplicate it. It wasn't just luck. But by the time you get to level 3, people outside the group that did the creation, the documentation, is able to replicate it. As you go to level 4, now we're seeing it used by multiple institutions. There's also a means to verify the implementation. Did you do it successfully? What happened? Why didn't it work? Enable trust. Trust because people know what you're doing. Guidelines for evolution, and standardized formats. So you can see the beginning of community use and a clear guidance on how the users should move forward. And then finally, in the level 5, we see the word endorsement appear. So endorsement is part of level 5. The activity or the method is used regionally. There's a process for improvement, and now we're introducing a process for quality control. And then finally, training is available. And it's sustained because there's continuing feedback, there's continuing evolution, and there's training. So those are the levels that we're talking about in the 5-level system. The details of these are available in a publication that was authored by Carlo Mantovani. It published last year in August in Frontiers, and it's called An Ocean Practices Maturity Model, From Good to Best Practices. We've been doing an assessment of the maturity model through interviews with principal authors of well-recognized papers, and so far working with Pauline Simpson. The total number of practices is 103 that have been interviewed. This has taken us many months, and we are continuing that, and it will be expanding. What happens in the interview, and I'll show you in just a moment, is certain methods have all the capabilities. They are a best practice, but many of them are missing one or two of the attributes. Maybe there's no room for feedback or there's no training. And so we talk with the authors about how to move forward and work with them to collaborate to make things best practices. And I show you here an example of some of the interviews, the results of some of the interviews that were done. The topics, as I show here, are diverse: genetic data analysis, eutrophication, CTD data, so measuring physical properties of the ocean, the Argo floats, and BGC and sensor data. The BGC in this case is, of course, the chemistry that goes with the ocean. Publication dates vary. The earliest ones from 1980, but many of them come from the last decade and are done by diverse organizations such as universities, in this case, University of Washington for the genetics, OSPAR and ICES as international organizations, Argo with its float focus, and other organizations. If you go through the attributes, now we're seeing the detailed attributes of level 5. The first one being endorsed. So now endorsement is playing a very, very important role in becoming a best practice. The practice is adopted at least regionally, moving from the multiple institutions of level 4 to a regional adoption. And the practice has a defined process or clear description of quality. You'll note here, by the way, that there are numbers next to each one. And in order to be a level 5, you have to achieve all of these or get a score of 1.0. Finally, we have tools available for users, user feedback, and also training. And here are the results of the interviews. And we see, for example, of all of the ones shown here, so there are 5, only one of them is a best practice with a score of 5. In fact, out of the 103 that we did, only 6 or 7 were best practices. And each of the practices, if they didn't achieve the definition of best practice, were lacking in one or two, perhaps, of the attributes, either endorsement, and we're working on further endorsement I'll talk about in a minute, and or the user feedback was not built into the system, or other attributes such as training were not available. And so when you get to looking for a best practice, and a certain number of these, about 100 of them, now have maturities assigned, and we're working on getting the others assigned, you can look to see where it is. Either it's a good practice, a better practice, or a best practice, and make your decisions based on that as one of the factors. Now let me turn, since we talked about endorsement here in 5.1, let me talk about endorsement. Endorsement is a process where an expert group and the community review the method in detail and then approve the document for use and for being labeled as endorsed. The endorsement process was started through the work of GUS and OBPS, led by Juliet Hermes, who was both on the OCG and on OBPS. And it was a discussion and a very nice description of how endorsement would occur done by GUS panels, the GUS panels being the physical, the chemistry, and the bioeco panels. This was done, and over a period of 4 years, 10 practices were endorsed. The need to go broader, to be able to let well-known institutions do endorsement of processes, was recognized, and OBPS created an endorsement process published by Mark Bushnell and myself to allow institutions to include an expert panel or a review of the method and recommend it for endorsement. And this is a process which is ongoing now. What OBPS, what GUS, and other organizations are looking at is a means of what I'll call self-endorsement, expert panels from teams that can do the endorsement, and then OBPS would review the process to assure conformity. We're in the process of putting that together now, so it will follow over the next 6 months to a year. Another issue or criteria might be the level of adoption. We've talked about either multiple institutions or regional, but how do you know how much adoption is occurring? We're looking now at creating metrics for adoption. Many of you are aware that, for example, there are either views in a journal or downloads in a journal, citations in a journal. These are metrics which the journals use and which you're using in OBPS also and EC OBPSS. But adoption goes beyond just downloading, it even goes beyond citations. And so how do we create a means, a metric for knowing that different organizations are actually using a method? We don't have an answer yet. And in fact, I would invite you, if you're interested in that, to contact me or the OBPS team. The other opportunities, the way we can do this, which move beyond just citations and maybe uses artificial intelligence as a core in this process. So if you're interested, OPSI for CLIM is interested in working with you and getting your advice. We are looking at detailed analysis in Frontiers in Marine Science, where they differentiate between citations which are in the introductory background section versus those that are in the methods section. So now you're having a methods description with a particular reference in it. That's one opportunity. We're also looking across the publications community. Again, I think it's an important area. It's not mature yet. So there still are mountains to climb. And let me now begin wrapping up in terms of a summary and tell you what the issues are that we see that we'd like your participation in. Streamlining maturity assessments. One of the issues we have is we've just done about 103 interviews. Those interviews take some hours to prepare, to carry out, and then to monitor. When you go to a scale of 2,000 different methods that are in the repository, you can multiply some hours times 2,000, and it becomes a very daunting task. So one thing that we're asking is, how do we streamline that? How do we get people engaged so that we can do this through a self-assessment followed by interviews, shorter interviews, or other means? And we'd love to discuss that with you, get your ideas. Moving on to endorsement, we want to do this at the global and regional level, and we're looking now at ways of collaborating across the community to provide multiple means for endorsement according to a standard process and addressing standard attributes. Quantifying adoption, I just talked about. It's a hard job. and ideas that you may have are very welcome. Let me move on to a couple of other things that are very important that I haven't discussed yet. One is relating data to methods. We see very, very good data repositories. In our case, we're working with eModNet, where they have data for a lot of different sensor types, and yet they don't have the methods that were used to collect the data, to create the data, to manage the data. And so we're working with eModNet now, that team, and under the OPSI for CLIM to relate methods to the data in the repository. And El Khalil Sharif is working with Antonio Novellino and Beatrice Scotto to develop the technique, to mature it, to identify authors of methods. The other thing that I want to highlight here is the idea of a federated network. We were approached by an expert in the bioecosystem, basically who is interested in aquaculture, who told us that there are many methods available in aquaculture, but they're in different various repositories. It's not clear where they are. If you want to compare methods, it's very, very difficult. And so we asked ourselves the question, can we give a federated portal, a single portal, which through collaborations with other repositories, we can give a single point access to a wide variety of methods. The first focus is on the aquaculture, and we're collaborating with the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN and ICES to develop a prototype which is being implemented through the work of ETT. And in doing this, we'll set a precedent, and then we've done interviews through a survey of European and international repositories of whether they do data, they do methods, or they do data and methods. And we're going to be working in the physical oceanography area toward a federated network. This will be over the next couple of years. The last thing I want to emphasize here in my mountains to climb is cultural change. As you saw, many of you don't use practices, and that's not a problem because it's an opportunity more than an issue. But you also are not familiar with the various practices available. And so this is a cultural shift. When we started this some decade ago, very, very few people had documented practices, and yet the need was recognized to some extent. And through the work of the OPPS system and the upcoming EC OPPSS, we're going to support and facilitate the use of practices and the cultural changes, the ability to publish, the ability to share among the various methods. And this is, again, a very good opportunity that I invite you to participate in. So with that as a summary of the challenges, let me just go through the overall presentation and summarize that. My emphasis, and the first one is specific to say to you that best practices are living documents. Many are created, and 3 and 5 years later, they're reviewed, they're updated. For example, ICES or HELCOM have routine reviews of best practices, and that keeps them living documents, and your feedback, as shown in the second bullet, is critical for that. I should emphasize here that the term best practices doesn't mean that all practices in a repository are best, as I showed from the maturity curve, but the term branding best practices was done in industry, and we have adopted it here. Recognize, however, that the maturity of a practice is very, very important. If we're going to use the feedback from you, the community, then the documents should be easy to update and not necessarily frozen in time. Practice endorsement and maturity will guide you, the new members, people who haven't used practices, on what to select. Differing infrastructure capabilities need to be addressed. Here's an issue that when we published the paper on maturity was raised by the peer reviewers, a very important point. The infrastructure capabilities in Europe or in the US or elsewhere are not necessarily the same as those in, let's say, South America or Africa or certain smaller countries that are around the world. And yet, to make a practice global, we have to be able to adapt it so that it will serve various levels of infrastructure capability. And this is something we're working on. We have a task team within OBPS that is looking at the methods used in Africa. It's led in part by European, by IFRAMER in this case, and the South African groups. And we want to address that. Training is essential. It's throughout the value chain. Not only do we have to understand what our particular narrow method may be for an observation, but maybe what's its impact downstream, or from the application viewpoint, what are the methods used to collect the data? So it's not only training for what you're doing, but also training across the value chain. And finally, and as important, is publishing best practices for sustaining and increase the visibility of your work. And we did create the opportunity to publish through the Frontiers in Marine Science. And I encourage you to look at that special issue, which has been continuing now for 7 or 8 years and will continue. And look through the opportunities to publish your work. And with that, I'd like to stop. And we have about 10 minutes left. I leave you a list of references. So if you go back to this particular presentation, many of the ones that are foundational, but also those relating to, for example, the recent work on endorsement, the first one, Bushnell and Pearlman, and the one that I mentioned about methods to create practices is the bottom one with Rachel Preslovsky et al. So with that, let me turn now to a discussion. I have put my email address. I would welcome your comments, but also your questions and your requests for support. And we as a team will work with you to do that. Thank you very much.